Hey friends, welcome to your Child's Pose tutorial. So in this little breakdown, we are going to go over a very common pose, Child's Pose, or in Sanskrit, Balasana. You may have heard Child's Pose called in your classes from restorative to vinyasa. It's often offered as an option to find a little respite, to take a break, or to give your body, your breath, a chance to catch up with the rest of a more vigorous class. Now, Child's Pose is intended this way, but it doesn't feel that way for every single body who practices it. So I want to use this time to kind of demystify the options you have when you're practicing this shape. So first things first, we're going to go over the general setup so you have an expectation of what the pose is supposed to look like. Then we'll go over options and modifications without any props, and then my personal favorite, with a lot of props. So the first setup for Child's Pose, this is a low to the ground pose. You will often hear knees go wide, big toes come together. We stretch our chest and our arms out in front of us, and almost in a sort of prostration type shape, you bow down and in theory, rest your forehead to the mat. So generally Child's Pose, although it is low to the ground energetically, it still has a pretty high prerequisite in the body. I need a lot of hip flexion, a lot of knee flexion. I gotta be able to reach my arms out. I gotta be able to reach the ground. So it's simple, but it's not easy. And that means that when it comes to class where you feel like you want a little respite, it may not always provide that for you. So a couple options that you have in a class where there are no props, or if that's not an option or it's too fast paced to be sliding things in and out, is to simply change the shape. So knees wide apart, big toes together. If that doesn't work for you, another option that you can do instead is instead of knees wide apart, kind of just the width of the mat, you might take them together. You take them together, and this alleviates that kind of big back bend that can happen, that dropping in here. And instead, you get support for your belly, for your chest, and you can reach here. If for any reason there's not space here, you have bigger belly, chest, more tissue and body in the way that doesn't allow for this type of compression, then you could even take your knees to the other end of the spectrum and take them much wider and ignore the cue about big toes together. Instead, it becomes more like a squat, sort of leaning back. Now you have space for your hips, for your belly, for everything to kind of drop down. It's almost like you're carving out a little bit of hole, digging out some space for yourself. So in the legs, it's always nice to just vary the width, to find a place anywhere along the spectrum. There's lots of pit stops that does fit in your body. Now the upper body, lots of options too, because stretching the arms overhead, right, that requires us to be able to go here. So if arms going forward feels like too much, and there's too much hang time, too deep of a hole underneath, then two things that I really like. First one is just bend at the elbows, stack the hands, and you make yourself a little pillow. Rest your forehead down. You can look to either side. This sometimes makes it easier to breathe because you're kind of up and off the ground. You have more space and air around your nose and your mouth. It alleviates any claustrophobic feelings that happen here. And then the second option is to take the arms totally out of the equation, wrap them around behind you, okay? If you combo this one with knees together, then it becomes a variation of Child's Pose called embryo pose, right? Hugging yourself down into a little tiny ball, a lot like the fetal position, and curling in. So now, especially after a really arm-heavy practice or a vigorous vinyasa practice where stretching your arms out might still feel like a lot of work, if I take them around, I can let my shoulders sort of drop down, relax, rest my head, and curl in on myself. So there's lots of ways to manipulate the shape, even if you don't have props. And these are just a few of the ways, but I would encourage you to experiment and see how each one works for you so that when that moment in class comes, you don't feel like you have to make a lot of decisions. You can just go somewhere that gives you that that you're looking for in the moment. Now, if we do have more time and we're not in a rush, in a restorative class or the opening, the closing of class, a home practice where you've got all the time in the world maybe, then I would highly encourage you to add some props to your practice. And they don't have to be these exact yoga props. You know, a bolster is just a fancy pillow. This is just a blanket, right? And these could be books. So you find something that works for you. But in the same way that we adjusted the knees, the hips, the arms, you can apply those here, but we're going to add props as well to kind of fill the space. So that way, instead of having to go all the way to the ground, we bring the ground up to us. Because as I'm coming into these shapes, you can see I've got a lot of fold in the hips and fold in the knees and rounding of the spine so that I can kind of slide and sink into it. But for many people, and maybe yourself included, child's pose does not look so low to the ground, and it's up quite a bit higher. Maybe it looks like this. And this is not so restful, it's actually quite a bit of work. Yeah, it doesn't feel like a place where you can kind of come back to yourself. So if I'm up higher, then what I want to do with my props is just try to fill the space. What can I put here to soften my landing? What can I put here so my hips and my legs can actually rest? Best thing to do, my favorite prop is a blanket, just because it's the most versatile. You can fold it all different ways, you can make it more, you can make it less, and this is a lovely one to start with. If the knees are sensitive, this can come underneath your knees and provide support. The knees are sensitive in the flexion. I like it even better if we take the blanket behind the knees. So I'm going to lean forward and slip the edge of the blanket way up into the crook of my knees, way into the crease. So that way, when I sit back, I've got some padding here. And I could roll it up more or less so that this angle becomes less dramatic. And now I've got a more open joint here. And for a lot of people, that's going to feel really, really nice. If we've got a lot of space to fill, that could even be a bolster and take the butt up way higher so we can sink into it and you're not hanging out in outer space. Okay, so number one, I like blanket. Number two, if you have a big bolster, it's great because again, now we've brought the earth up to us. So instead of digging out a hole for ourselves, we've actually added a pillow. That is softness. And that means when I come forward, I can simply rest here. It gives my arms something to do to kind of slide that bolster up and underneath. My knees might even be able to hug in and give me a little security here. And then I can rest. Right, flipping your head maybe halfway through the hold, anywhere that feels good on your neck, so that you have essentially a body pillow to hug into, nice and cozy and comfy. Okay? And then lastly, certainly not the only options, but a personal favorite is to use all of the things. Okay, so now I'm going to add blocks underneath. And this is really good, especially in a restorative beginning or end of practice when it's really worth the time to set up, because it truly is worth it, I promise, is to take my 2 blocks and put it underneath the bolster. Because now I have the best of both worlds. I have not only added a body pillow, but I've also dug out a hole for myself because I'm going to come forward into this. And again, you make space. If you've got bigger belly, things in the way, you just slide the bolster forward and back so you have room for yourself, because that's first and foremost the most important. But now I can hug, and I can really hug. So I'm going to take my arms underneath this little hole so I can squeeze in and release. Because it's easy to underestimate how much tension we hold when we feel like we have to hold ourselves there. Right? In theory, it's easy, but in practice, it's not. So having something soft and supportive can help get your physical system and then in turn your nervous system to actually relax and release here. And this is great. And you could be here for a very long time. So some combination of blocks, bolsters, blankets is going to give you the most support along the way in this shape. And there will certainly be times, people, bodies, where you just can't get there. You can't get comfy, like any pose, right? So instead of trying to manipulate your body to fit the pose, instead, we just change the pose to fit our body. So you can always, always, always set that aside and just come to a seat. Right? You need a moment to collect yourself during practice. You are taking breathing instead of moving through flow. You can always sit here on a bolster, on a blanket, those same ideas of adding some softness, and collect yourself here in a more upright position. Because ultimately, child's pose is about the energetic tone of the shape. It's what we're trying to achieve with it. But the logistics of it, I would say those are more up for debate, and they really need to work for you, because if we can't get to the energy of it, then why are we doing it in the first place? So practice what makes you feel good. Find a way to make the shape work for you so that it is a positive part of your practice and your yoga journey. Try this on the mat this week when you practice, and I will see you again next time.